I cut ties with my mother for choosing my stepfather over me and our family bookstore, and years later she returned only to beg me for money. I, a 28-year-old female, have been estranged from my parents for almost 7 years now. I cut ties with them after my grandpa passed away, and my mother decided to let my stepdad take over the local bookstore that my grandparents ran. My father passed away when I was 3 years old from a sudden heart attack. Nobody had seen it coming, and everyone was left in shock when it happened. My father's parents cut ties with my mom soon after his demise, and she never saw them again. My grandparents took my mother and me in, and we lived with them for the first couple of years after my father's passing. My mother had been a stay-at-home mom ever since she gave birth to me, so it was difficult for her to find a job. Even when she did find one, it was a low-paying position, and she had to work twice as hard to earn the same commission and bring home sufficient income. She could have run the bookstore with her parents, but she believed it wouldn't have a great payout in the long run and was more of a hobby than an actual job. Instead, she worked as a saleswoman for a stationery company, and in a couple of years she saved enough to get a place of her own. When I was around 6 or 7 years old, we moved out of my grandparents' house and into a place of our own. Up until then, it was just me and my mother because she was too focused on her work to divert her energy anywhere else. Besides, she still loved my dad deeply, and I would often catch her looking at photos of him and crying. However, after we got a place of our own, she started dating other people. I'll admit, I was a little upset about it at first because I thought she was going to start putting me second. I don't know why I felt that way, maybe it was just a gut feeling, but I felt like something bad was going to happen if she started dating other men. I used to think these things, but I never let it affect my behavior, and I was always nice to her boyfriends. I also never let my mother suspect that I felt uneasy about the number of boyfriends she brought home. I'm a progressive woman myself, and have had my share of flings and casual relationships. But I also think that if I had a child, I would probably think twice before bringing everyone home. I don't know why it never occurred to my mother. All I knew was that every other week, there would be a different guy. I don't know exactly what she was trying to do, but I didn't have a good feeling about it. I stayed quiet about it because I didn't want to make my mother feel bad. She had worked hard and had grieved enough. Also, I was just a kid, so I didn't know how to express myself accurately without sounding like an idiot. So, I never said anything because I was scared of hurting my mom's feelings. Then, when I was around 10 years old, she started dating Steven. Initially, he seemed like a nice guy. He came over a couple of times, and we got along well. He was kind to me, and that was it. I expected that, just like her other relationships, this would probably not last for more than a couple of weeks, and would fizzle out soon enough. Surprisingly, months passed, and they continued to see each other. He would come over more often once they started getting serious, and occasionally he would even have dinner and spend the night at our place. Naturally, I started interacting with him more. I realized he was quite different from the guys my mother used to date. Unlike the others, he also seemed serious about my mother, which I liked. However, I also got a strange vibe from him after meeting him. My mother started changing certain things about herself, and I was pretty sure it was for his sake. He had a dominating and assertive personality, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for some reason my mother was overly submissive. I picked up on her unusual behavior around him. Whenever he came over, she would turn into a different person altogether, and it felt like I didn't even know who I was talking to. She would try her best to agree with him on everything, and it honestly felt like I was watching a smitten teenager trying to impress a high school senior. It was weird, and any time I was around them, I felt like I was intruding on something very personal, even if they were just sitting around doing nothing. I had never seen my mother that way, even with the other guys she had dated. She seemed to like them, sure, but she never put in a real effort to change herself to make herself more likable. But she did that with Steven, and I didn't feel good about it. Again, I was just a kid at the time, and even though I felt something was off, I couldn't exactly bring it up and talk to her about it. She was my mother, and there were certain things I couldn't discuss with her simply because they were inappropriate for a 10-year-old to say. So, once again, I chose not to say anything and kept my mouth shut. Even when my grandparents came around, I never brought up her strange behavior or her new boyfriend. They asked me a couple of times about how they were getting along and if I liked him or not, and I always gave answers I knew my mother would approve of. After dating for about a year, Steven moved in with us, and that's when things really started changing around the house. For instance, he changed all the decorations in our house and made them more gender-neutral, as he put it. It would have made sense if all the decorations were pink, frilly, and feminine, but that was not the case. It was already pretty neutral in my opinion. We had decorated our place normally like everyone else, but for some reason, that seemed hyper-feminine to him. He came along and changed everything. making it hyper-masculine instead. By the time we were done redecorating, our house literally looked like a bachelor pad. He was quite impressed with it and said it finally reminded him of home. I don't understand how that was a good thing because before that he lived with a bunch of younger roommates. I wanted to complain about it, but I didn't because my mother told me not to, and my room remained untouched, so it was okay. But then, slowly, he started changing other things as well. He got my mother to stop eating meat because he read somewhere that it was bad for the body, and he didn't want her to gain weight and become unhealthy. So both of them switched to being vegetarian and tried to get me to switch as well. Thankfully, I was at school and told them I needed the protein to keep up, so they didn't force me much. I wouldn't say that was a bad change, but my mother had been the biggest fan of hamburgers and all things meaty before she met Stephen, so it was a huge sacrifice. He also forced her to go off sugar, which made her immensely cranky, which was not good for me because she would never get mad at him, but would snap at me for the smallest things. There were also many other healthy lifestyle changes he incorporated into their lives, but honestly, it was all just random stuff he read on the internet and made everyone paranoid about by building it up in his own head. He was a really weird man, but my mom seemed to like him, and as long as he was happy, I didn't want to say anything about it. Besides, it wasn't like he was forcing me to do anything, so I was fine with it. Then they got married, and a couple of months after their marriage, my mother announced that she was planning to quit her job because she was pregnant again. I thought that was great news, and I was excited about having a little sibling, but at the same time, I didn't think quitting her job was the best move. The kind of control Stephen seemed to have over her was suspicious, and even though nothing bad had come of it yet, I didn't think it was safe for her to quit her job and rely completely on her husband. I tried to convince her several times not to quit, but she told me it was none of my business, and that since I was a child I should stick to doing things kids do and not poke my nose where it didn't belong. After a while, I stopped trying to talk to her about it and decided she was a grown woman who knew what was best for her. I was also sick of her telling me to stay out of things that didn't concern me, because I don't think she realized that her actions definitely concerned me since I was part of the family too. I was probably 15 or 16 at the time, so I wasn't exactly a kid either. Anyway, I decided to stay out of it and mind my own business. Unfortunately, my mom lost the baby around 3 months into the pregnancy. It was devastating for her, and as a family, we took it hard. She was in her late 30s at the time, so the doctor said the complications happened because of her advanced age. Stephen was extremely disappointed, and there was a phase in their marriage after the loss where they were sleeping in different rooms and barely speaking to each other. It was really sad because my mother was already going through something upsetting, and the only person she should have been able to count on wasn't even talking to her. Apparently, he told her he needed space to get his head straight and process everything. For a few months, they were basically just flatmates, discussing only bills and groceries and nothing more. During that time, my mother really opened up to me, and it helped me reconnect with her, which made everything much worse when she later forced me to cut her off. When Stephen wasn't speaking to her, she reached out to me and my grandparents, and we were the ones there for her. My grandmother also fell sick around the time my mother lost her baby, which was probably part of the reason she started reconnecting with us. A couple of months later, my grandmother passed away. A few weeks after the funeral, Stephen started making an effort to make my mom feel better again, so they began rebuilding their relationship. However, I had already lost faith in him. I started disliking him because he lost my respect when he gave my mother the cold shoulder after she lost the baby. I thought it was a really low thing to do, and after that I never considered trying to fix our relationship either. During the time he was ignoring my mother, he also started giving me the cold shoulder, and we had even less to talk about than he did with my mother. We were practically not on speaking terms at the time. After my grandmother's passing, he started trying to fix his relationship with my mother, but by then I had already made up my mind about him. I knew I didn't like or trust him. About a year after that, I left for college. Stephen and my mother had started marriage counseling by then, and they were doing great. On weekends, I would try to visit them and divide my time between my mother and my grandpa. My grandpa was really lonely after my grandma passed away, so I thought it was important to keep in touch with him. He was handling the bookstore business alone, and I started thinking that after I graduated from college, I would work at the bookstore and handle their finances or something. However, I never got the opportunity because a few weeks before my graduation, I received news from my mother that my grandfather had passed away in his sleep. I was glad he passed away peacefully, but I was also upset that I didn't get a chance to say one last goodbye. To add to that, on the day of the funeral, my mother told me that his lawyer, who was the executor of his will, informally told her she was going to inherit the bookstore business. I guess my grandpa hadn't changed his will before he passed, and I was apparently going to inherit the house where my grandparents lived and where I spent most of my childhood. Even after moving out with my mother, we frequently visited them. I was happy I was going to inherit the house, and I knew my mother had no interest in running a bookstore, so I planned to ask her to let me take over instead. I thought it would be a nice starting point for me, and the bookstore business wasn't doing too badly. It still got customers and was doing decently. A couple of weeks after the funeral, after the will was read, I decided to speak to my mother about it. Instead, she told me she had already spoken to Stephen, and he was going to take over. I thought that was majorly unfair. Even though my grandpa legally left the bookstore to her, I felt she should have allowed me to run the business. I tried to tell her I had a special bond with my grandparents, and when my grandpa was alone after Grandma's passing, I had been helping him run the bookstore anyway. I knew the finances and felt it would have been fair for me to at least be a partner in the business, with Stephen, if that's what my mother wanted. But she was stubborn and told me she had already promised Stephen he could take over the business. He was going to turn it into a franchise and take it to new heights, so I needed to stay out of his way. Truth be told, I didn't think Stephen had it in him. We were one of the exceptionally lucky bookstores still doing well in this era, so the idea of expanding seemed far-fetched and unachievable just yet. I thought it would be better to start small and improve the one location we had. We had many arguments about this, but a couple of days later, my mother told me her decision was final, and no amount of arguing would change her mind. She said I needed to give up because I was getting on her last nerve. She claimed she knew her parents, and they would want the same thing Stephen wanted, so I needed to stay out of it because I didn't know the situation as well as she did. She told me Stephen had been having a hard time at his workplace and had been thinking about quitting for a while. He finally had the opportunity to do so with something to fall back on, and she said I wasn't going to take that away from him. She told me to drop all ideas of trying to take the business from him, and if I couldn't, I could just leave them alone, since I was already a grown-up and could handle life on my own. That was a really nasty thing to say, especially to defend Stephen. My mother and I got into a really bad fight, and since that day, we hadn't spoken. I left the house that day, and after I graduated, I never heard from or texted her again. She made it clear that either I would be okay with Stephen running the bookstore or I could leave, so I chose to leave, and I stuck to it. 7 years have passed since then, and a lot has changed. I graduated, moved into my own apartment, and got my first job. I also started seeing my boyfriend Dean a couple of years ago. Life has been good, and I don't mind how things turned out. Of course, I would miss my mother occasionally, but then I would remember what she said to me the day I left, and I would stop thinking about her. I'd like to say I had completely forgotten about my mom and healed from everything, but that's not how it turned out. I didn't mind that she wasn't speaking to me, but I couldn't help feeling she was choosing Stephen over me. Deep down, I always knew that if it came down to it, she would pick Stephen over me. I had hoped I was wrong, but when I wasn't, it shattered any illusions about my mother and effectively ended our relationship. I didn't even have my grandparents around anymore, so I had no reason to keep in touch with her. 7 years passed with zero news of her or how she was doing. I live in a different part of the city now, and we didn't have overlapping circles. I had told my relatives I didn't want to hear anything about her because I wasn't interested, as it would only hurt me. To sum it up, I didn't know anything about what my mother had been up to in the past 7 years since I cut her off. But then, a couple of weeks ago, I heard from one of my cousins that my mother had been asking around for my phone number and address. She wanted to know if it was okay to tell my mother where I was living so she could visit me. I found it a little odd, but I had changed numbers after I left and blocked her on all social media, so this was the only way she could reach me. After some deliberation, I told my cousin I was okay with it because, to be honest, I really wanted to know what my mother wanted to talk about after so long. So, I told her to give my mother my address. A day later, she visited me alone. I was a little surprised Stephen hadn't accompanied her, but we were never that close, so it wasn't surprising. My mother and I had a tearful reconciliation, and after that, we got to talking. I told her about my life and introduced her to Dean. She kept asking about my job and how I was doing financially, which I thought was a little weird, but I didn't think much of it because it was natural for a mother to want to know how her kid was doing. The only thing that felt off was that we hadn't been in touch for almost 7 years, and all she wanted to know was how well I was getting paid. She could probably tell I wasn't struggling because I had a nice lifestyle, reflected in how I had decorated my home. In spite of that, when she kept asking subtle questions, I started to think maybe there was something going on, and perhaps she had ulterior motives for visiting. After a while, she finally dropped the bomb and let go of any pretense that she had come to fix things with me. She said she was glad to hear I was doing great financially because she really needed my help. She told me the bookstore business wasn't doing well, and Stephen was struggling to keep it afloat. His grand ideas of expanding and becoming a franchise hadn't worked out because he had multiple locations, but none were selling. He had also borrowed money from friends and family, which he now had to repay. They had put all their money into the business, but there were no returns, so they were struggling to pay their bills. They couldn't imagine what would happen if their friends and family started asking for their money back. They were in serious financial trouble, so they wanted me to bail them out. My mother said she came to see me to talk about this, and while talking, she deduced I made a decent income and could help them at least a little. If that wasn't embarrassing enough, she then pointed at my boyfriend and said that since he was going to become part of the family anyway, even Dean could contribute and help keep the family business. I don't know why she thought I would help her out like that. But the second I realized she came only for help and not to apologize, I decided to tell her she could leave because I wasn't interested. To be clear, had she come with the intention of fixing things between us and making up for lost time, I might have considered helping her. But she only wanted my money, and the fact that she dragged Dean into it didn't sit right with me. So, I told her to leave, and we got into another fight. She called me selfish and ungrateful and said she regretted even trying to reach out. I didn't hold back either, and let out all my frustration from when I was a child. After she left, Dean had to help me calm down for almost an hour because I was so worked up. I also found it annoying that only my mother showed up to ask for help when it was Stephen who had screwed everything up. I was just really pissed off about a lot of things, and that's why I refused to help them. My mother and I had a strained relationship ever since she married Stephen, and it reached a breaking point almost 7 years ago. Recently, I thought things might get better, but they didn't, and my disappointment and anger got the better of me, which is why I turned her away. She didn't speak to me again until a couple of days ago. I had also forgotten about the whole episode until she called me a few days back and told me they had no option but to give up the business and sell everything because they were struggling financially. They had told everyone they borrowed money from that the business wasn't doing well, and everybody wanted their money back. She made it sound like it was all my fault and said that if I had helped her that day, not even for her sake but for my grandparents, this wouldn't have happened. Now, they had nothing left to give, and selling was their only option. I know I shouldn't feel guilty, but I do. I feel like I've let my grandparents down. I know how much that bookstore meant to them, and God knows it meant the same to me. Knowing it's going to slip out of my hands isn't easy to deal with. I could do something now, but I feel like my mother and Stephen haven't earned it, and I don't want to go back on my word, but I also don't want to let the business go because then I would feel like a total jerk. So, am I the jerk for not bailing my parents out because the business they took over instead of me isn't doing well? Update. Hi, first off, thank you all so much for the comments on my post. I have thought about it and decided I'm not going to help my mother directly. But, like you all said, I really didn't want to let my parents screw up my grandparents' legacy. They had put a lot of hard work into something of their own, and I wasn't going to allow my parents to mess that up. So, I decided to get in touch with a friend of mine, and together we decided to buy them out. I'm not going to screw my mother out of a fair price. My friend is pretty wealthy since he inherited a restaurant business from his father a couple of months ago. They have also been looking to expand, and they think a bookstore plus cafe would be a perfect idea. So, they're buying my parents out, and since I approached him with this idea, I'm going to be their partner. The only thing left to do now is to speak to my mom. I'm just hoping she hasn't found other buyers yet because that would complicate things. It seems unlikely though, since it's only been a few weeks. I'm guessing nothing has been finalized yet. Anyway, I'm keeping my fingers crossed and hoping for the best. Update 2. It's been 2 days since my last update, and half an hour ago, I got off a phone call with my mother. I told her all about the idea my friend and I had, and I mentioned that this would be a purely business deal. I was speaking to her in a professional capacity, and she actually seemed open to the idea. She told me she would talk to Stephen and let us know. So, I think this is going to happen now. It's really exciting because I had always wanted something like this, and now I think it's actually going to materialize. Dean and I are already celebrating. Update 3. Okay, it's been a couple of weeks since the last post, but I've been really busy because my mother and Stephen agreed to our deal. They got their way out of the business, and now my friend and I have taken over. There is a lot of renovation to be done, and we are overseeing all of it. It's a long way until we find and start making money off this, but I'm hopeful. I know my grandparents would be proud of me, and I just have this feeling that this is all going to work out for the best. I can't explain it, but I just know it. Now, all I need is everybody's blessings. Thank you so much to everyone who was there all along with me. Thank you for all the lovely comments and messages. It really means the world to me.